Gwen couldn't stop talking about what had just happened, and I couldn't help but feel that Diane Barclay was destined to fall in love with Vaughn Foster. I couldn't read her mind, but I knew what I felt. The next day, as we were riding home, I saw a group of dark horses and riders quickly approaching us. We were on the main road, in plain sight of the town and passing by ranches, but I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was off. I didn't think it was necessary to race our horses just to get to town a little earlier than these strangers. As a result, they caught up with us quickly. There were 5 of them, all with dark faces except for one, who was dressed in dark clothing and mounted on a dark bay or black horse. They had no pack animals and didn't seem to be carrying any packs. 4 of them passed us at a gallop, while the 5th matched our pace and rode between Gwen and me. "Good day," he said to me in a friendly tone. "I hope you don't mind if I ride with you all." Given his pleasant demeanor, I couldn't help but be polite. He was a remarkably handsome man, under 40 years old, with curly blonde hair that was almost golden, a fair complexion for that region, and the clearest, boldest blue eyes I had ever seen in a man. "You must be Tim," he said. "Some of my men have seen you riding around with Barclay's girls. I'm Jack Blome." He didn't say his name with any arrogance or pomp. He simply stated it. Blome, the rustler. I felt uneasy all over. Nevertheless, it appeared that there was nothing for me to do but return his kindness. I felt less nervous after he introduced himself. I introduced him to the girls without any awkwardness. He took off his hat and made a gallant bow to both of them. Miss Barclay had heard of him and his reputation, and she couldn't help but become pale and shrink back, although he didn't seem to notice. Gwen had been eager to meet a real rustler, and here he was, the Prince of Rascals. However, I sensed that she would need some time before she felt comfortable. Blome appeared to be more interested in Gwen than in Diane. "Do you like Pecos?" he asked Gwen. "Out here? Oh, yes, indeed," she responded. "Do you like to ride?" he asked. "I love horses," Gwen replied. Like most men who met Gwen, he quickly realized that talking about horses was the best way to keep her interested. He clearly loved thoroughbred horses himself and spoke to Gwen with genuine interest. He could have been anyone, but there was something different about him. He was a desperado, one of the reckless and daring kind that were known along the Pecos and Rio Grande. He wore clothes that were not typical of most Westerners, made of silk, velvet, and fine leather. His spurs were worth coveting, and he carried a short rifle and a gun in saddle sheaths. As I looked him over, I noticed a row of notches on the bone handle of his Colt, indicating the number of men he had killed. This made my blood boil, as I was a ranger, and such practices were abhorrent to me. As we reached the edge of town, Blome doffed his hat and rode off ahead of us. I found it difficult to keep up with the excited chatter of the 2 young ladies. Miss Langdon was particularly taken with Blome, saying that she could adore him. Miss Barclay also joined in with compliments for the rustler. I needed time to think, but their chatter made it difficult. My frustration was a sign that my thoughts were turning to anger. "Jack Blome," I interrupted their praises. "He's a rustler and a gunman. Did you notice the marks on his gun? Each mark represents a man he's killed. For weeks we've been hearing rumors in Linrock that he's planning to come here and get rid of that troublesome Texas Ranger, Vaughn Foster." Chapter 7. The weight of my words hit me hard as I watched Gwen's heart break before me. "Oh, Tim, no, no!" she cried out. Diane Barclay stood nearby, her eyes fixed on the hill and the ranch in front of us. Though her gaze was distant, I could see the truth in her eyes. She loved Foster. I couldn't bear to leave Miss Barclay with the impression that I had intended. My own emotions were twisted, as I had once suffered through love, and now I reveled in seeing her suffer the same fate. But now that my cruel desire for her to love Foster had come true, I felt only pity for her and the enormity of my actions. It was a crime to make this noble and beautiful woman love a ranger, the enemy of her father and the author of her future misery. I was horrified at what I had done. Desperately, I tried to justify my actions with my old motive, that through her love we might all be saved. But it was too late, and I knew that my motive had been wrong and unjustified. We rode home in silence, Miss Barclay dismounting at a path leading to the trees and flowers. "I want to rest, to think before I go in," she said. Gwen and I rode our horses to the corrals. As we approached the gate, I noticed the tears in her eyes and knew my fears had been confirmed. "Tim," she said, "it's worse than we thought." "Worse? No kidding," I replied. It's going to devastate her. She's never cared that much for anyone before. When the Barkley women love, they love hard." "Well, at least you're a Langdon," Gwen retorted bitterly. "I'm Barkley enough to be miserable, but Langdon enough to have some sense. You, on the other hand, have no sense or kindness. Why did you have to blurt out that Jack Blome was here to kill Foster?" "I'm ashamed, Gwen," I admitted, hanging my head. "I've been a brute. I wanted her to love Foster for some stupid reason. I just wanted to see how much she cared. The other day you said misery loves company, and that's exactly what I've been doing. I've been bitter and angry, taking my frustration out on Miss Barkley. It was a damn unmanly thing for me to do." "It's not that bad," Gwen replied gently. "But you could have been more tactful. Tim, you're taking a very tragic view of your own situation." "Tragic? Ha!" I exclaimed, feeling like a villain in a play. "What other way is there to look at it? I love you so much it's consuming me." "That's not tragic," Gwen said softly. "When you have no chance, that's tragic." Gwen could shift moods quickly, and now she seemed warm, vulnerable, and sincere. I felt myself slipping, but managed to catch myself before saying anything foolish. The bitter realization of renunciation made it easy for me to feign anger. "You promised not to do it again," I began, choking on my own words. My voice was hoarse and it broke, but I knew I couldn't pretend any longer. I had seen Gwen Langdon in various states of emotion before, but never like this. She was pale and trembling slightly. If it wasn't fear, then I couldn't tell what it was. But there was also a sense of contrition and earnestness about her. "Tim, I know. I promised not to tease or tempt you anymore," she faltered. "I've broken it. I'm ashamed. I haven't played fair, but I can't help myself. I have enough sense not to engage myself to you, but I can't stop loving you. I can't leave you alone. There, I said it. What's more, I'll continue as I have unless you stay away from me. I don't care what I deserve or what you do. I will. She began faltering, but ended with a passionate outburst. Somehow I managed to keep my composure, even though my heart was pounding like a hammer and my blood was rushing in my ears. The thought of Foster saved me, but I felt a chill run down my spine at the narrow margin. I feared that a kiss or a single touch from this bewitching creature of fire and change and sweetness would make me put her before Foster and my duty. "Gwen, if you dare break your promise again, you'll regret ever being born," I said with all the fierceness I could muster. "I already regret it. And you can't bluff me, Mr. Gambler. I may not have a hand to play, but you can't make me fold," she replied. Something told me that Gwen Langdon was discovering herself and that soon I wouldn't be able to scare her anymore. And then I knew I would be doomed. "I don't want to distress you, Miss Barkley," I began, "but I must tell you something. Blome has come to Linrock after Foster. He intends to kill him." Miss Barkley's face went white as a sheet. "Oh, no," she whispered. "What can we do?" "Well, I don't believe he can do it," I said confidently. "Blome's not man enough. But I wanted to let you know so you can be careful." "Thank you, Mr. Adams," she said gratefully. "I will be careful." As I walked away, I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. I had done the right thing by telling her, and I had also managed to keep my own feelings for Gwen hidden. It was a tricky situation, but I had handled it with all the coolness and strength of a seasoned cowboy. The storm had passed, and her pale face and calm demeanor showed it. Despite the situation at hand, she always had a smile for me. However, I felt guilty for betraying her trust. "Miss Barkley," I started, stumbling over my words, "I was thinking maybe you're upset about this gunfighter Blome coming to kill Foster. At first I thought it was because of the potential bloodshed, but then I realized you were interested in Foster's ranger work. Maybe you care about him." "Don't beat around the bush, Tim," she interrupted. "You know I care." Her eyes were a wonder to behold, dark and sad, with the soul of a woman at the bottom. I admired her honesty and was inspired to be truthful myself. "Listen," I said, "Blome has come to meet Foster, and there will be a fight, but Blome won't be able to kill Foster." Miss Barkley was confused. "How is that possible? You said Blome was a killer with notches on his gun. Why won't he succeed?" "Because Foster will be on the lookout, and Blome won't be quick enough on the draw to kill him. Foster is one of the best shots on the frontier, and I doubt there's anyone who could beat him in a fair fight." Miss Barkley wanted to know more. "I understand, but tell me more about this fair fight. What do you mean?" "Well, Blome is conceited, and he'll want to make the meeting fair. But even then, I don't think he'll be quick enough to beat Foster. It'll be a close one, but I believe Foster will come out on top. Blome plans to search for Foster by making a big show of his presence. However, Foster is likely to avoid him for as long as he can. If they do come face to face, Blome will have to make the first move. Foster has a strange effect on people, and it will be interesting to see how Blome handles him. Blome may know of Foster's reputation, but he has never seen him in action. Foster is a master of handling a gun, and no one can beat him in a quick draw. There was an outlaw named Dwayne who might have been able to take down Foster, but he never got the chance. A girl saved Dwayne and turned him into a ranger, and he left Texas for good. The woman listening to this story finds it fascinating and wants to know more. She asks if it really comes down to the quickness of the hand when men face each other in this part of Texas. I confirm that it is all about the draw, and Foster is the best at it. I demonstrate my own quick draw, and the woman is impressed. She admits that it's horrible to be interested in such a thing, but she is caught up in the wildness of the frontier and is glad to know that Foster has the skill to protect himself. "Thanks, Tim," she said as she stood up and turned away slightly. Then she paused. One hand was on her chest and the other was on the bench. "Have you talked to him recently?" she asked, and a faint blush appeared on her cheeks. Her eyes were steady and deep, staring through me. "Yeah, I've run into him a few times around town," I replied. "Did he ever mention me?" she asked. "Once or twice, and he couldn't help it," I said. "What did he say?" she asked. "The last time I saw him, he seemed eager to hear about you. He didn't ask, but he was practically begging. So I told him everything I knew about you, how you dressed, how you looked, what you said, what you did. I hope you're not offended, Miss Barkley. I tend to talk too much sometimes." She didn't hear my apology or my plea. There was a certain glow in her eyes. As I looked at her, my vision became blurry and hazy. "What did he say?" she whispered shyly, and I could hardly believe that the proud Miss Barkley was standing before me. "Well, he flew into a rage and called me a—" I stopped myself. "He said that if I wanted to talk to him again, I shouldn't mention you. He was being unreasonable." "Tim, do you think he still—" She wasn't facing me anymore. Her head was bent down, and both of her hands were on her chest. I saw her chest heave, and her cheeks were white as a flower. Her neck was red with mounting blood. I understood what was happening. I pitied her, hated myself, and was amazed by this thing called love. It had turned Diane Barkley into a different woman. I could hardly believe it when Diane Barkley came to me, practically begging for reassurance of Foster's love. As someone who knew nothing about women, this seemed odd to me. But then a thought hit me like a ton of bricks. Had Diane figured out her father's guilt? Was it for his sake more than her own that she hoped Foster loved her? It was a mystery, and it gave me a lot to think about. Only a strong motive or an all-consuming love could make someone like Diane Barkley, who was so full of pride, ask such a question. No matter the reason, I was determined to assure her that what I knew to be true. I spoke to her with all the emotion I could muster, telling her that I could see how much Foster loved her, how deeply and passionately. I also warned her that his love for her would make his work in Linrock extremely difficult. But she seemed to understand, and there was a stillness about her that reminded me of Gwen when I proposed to her. "Tim, please bring us together," Diane pleaded. "You're our friend." And then she was gone, leaving me feeling both honored and cursed to have been chosen by Foster as his partner in this dangerous game. Later that evening, I found myself in the girls' sitting room, where they asked me about the gunfighters, outlaws, and other dangerous men of the frontier. Diane and Gwen had been completely ignorant of such characters before moving to Texas, but now they were both fascinated and repelled by them. It seemed that Diane might have placed the Rangers in the same category as these dangerous men, just like her father and Governor Smith. Gwen believed she had fallen for a cowboy who had a reputation as bad as they come. She was convinced he was the real deal. As for me, I knew a thing or two about dangerous and wicked men. Being from Texas, I was well versed in the subject. It was a challenge to differentiate between the good and bad fighters, but spotting a genuine outlaw from a phony was easy for someone like me. So I regaled the girls with stories of notorious outlaws like Buck Duane, who was both an outlaw and a ranger. I also shared the tales of Morrell, Hardin, Sandoval, Cheseldine, Bland, Alloway, Kingfisher, Thompson, and Sterrett. These men were all still alive and kicking, leaving a trail of bloodshed and crime in their wake. But I saved the best story for last. Amos Clark was unlike any other outlaw I had ever known. He was a man of influence and wealth, respected by his peers. He was an upstanding citizen who fought against rustlers and outlaws. But as it turned out, he was the leader of a gang of rustlers, highwaymen, and murderers. Captain Neal and his rangers uncovered Clark's true identity and brought him to justice. He was arrested and eventually hanged for his crimes. It just goes to show that sometimes the most dangerous men are the ones who hide in plain sight. The case was one that stood out, showcasing what was possible in the untamed country. Clark had a son who was honest and a wife he cherished deeply. Both were entirely unaware of the darker side of life. I recounted this story deliberately, albeit with some concern. I needed to see if Miss Barkley was suspicious of her father, and to look into her eyes was no easy feat. However, when I did, I was shocked, though not in the way I anticipated. She knew something, perhaps more than Foster or I, but if it was a crime, she concealed her true feelings remarkably well. Jack Blome and his men had been in Linrock for several days, accompanied by old Snecker, his son Bo, and other rough-looking individuals, unfamiliar to me but not to Linrock. They created a charged, anticipatory atmosphere. The saloons did unprecedented business and never closed. Respectable townspeople were roused from their slumber by rowdy carousing in the streets at dawn. Foster remained largely under cover, not believing, nor did I, that Blome and his gang would target him the first time he walked down the street. Such occurrences were rare, and when they did happen, it was more coincidence than intention. Blome was preparing the stage for his little play. Meanwhile, Foster was not idle. He informed me he had met Jim Dempsey, Morton, and Zimmer, and that these men had approached others of a similar ilk. A secret club had formed, and all members were primed for action. Foster had also spent hours at night observing the house where Reuben Darling stayed when he wasn't at Barkley's. Darling had almost recovered from his arm injury, but he remained indoors most of the time. At night, his house was visited by strange, swift, and stealthy men who were previously strangers and not his neighbors. Foster could not recognize any of these visitors, and he did not think it was time to confront them. Jim Dempsey had declared that something was amiss, something different from Blome's intention of meeting the ranger. Dempsey was correct. Within 24 hours of his conversation with Foster, where he recommended quick action, he was found dead behind the little room of his restaurant with a bullet hole in his chest. No one heard any shots, and it was a deliberate murder since a piece of paper with the words, "All friends of Ranger Foster look for the same," was left behind the bar. Later that day I met Foster at Dempsey's and accompanied him when he viewed the body and the written message that indicated hostility towards him. We left together, and I hoped he would allow me to stay with him from that moment on. "Tim, it's all in the dark," he said. "I believe Darling is involved." I agreed. "I recall his face at Dempsey's when you wounded him. Jim insisted that you were wrong not to kill him instead of wounding him. You were wrong." "No, Tim, I never let my emotions get the best of me. We can't prove anything against Darling." "Let's find him. I bet I can accuse him and make him reveal his hand. Come on." Foster found it challenging to resist me, but that was all the satisfaction I received from my anger and desire to avenge Jim Dempsey, which consumed me. "Listen up, son. You're going to find yourself in a whole heap of trouble soon enough," Foster warned me. "Just hold tight and keep your eyes on Barkley at night. See if anyone's coming to visit him. Spy on him. I'll keep an eye on Darling." "Don't you think it'd be better if you stayed out of town, especially at night?" I asked. "Sure thing. I've got some blankets out in the brush, and I go there every night and leave before daylight. But I keep a light on in the adobe house to make it look like I'm there." "Good idea. I was worried about that. Now, what's going to happen with Morton, Zimmer, and their crew after Jim Dempsey's murder?" "They're all seeing red, Tim. They're out for blood. If we need backup, I just have to say the word." "Have you seen Blome around?" "Once. I was across the street when he came out of the Hope So with some of his gang. They watched me, but I just kept going." "He's looking for trouble, Foster." "Yeah, and he'd have found it by now if I knew his connection to Barkley and Darling." "Do you think he's a dangerous man to meet?" "Not really. He's a genuine bad man, but he's not much to be feared. If he'd just keep away from trouble, that'd be a different story. Blome will probably die thinking he's the toughest and quickest draw in the West." That settled my worries. "For now, let's help out Jim Dempsey's family," Foster suggested. "His wife's not doing too well. She's got a lot of kids and Jim was poor. She told me her neighbors would avoid her now out of fear. It's tough, but we can give Jim a decent burial and help out his family, Foster had said to me. A few days later, I took Miss Barkley and Gwen to visit Jim Dempsey's wife and children. I knew Foster would be there, but I didn't tell Miss Barkley. We rode to Mrs. Dempsey's little adobe house, which Foster and I had moved her and the children into after Jim's funeral. The house was small but cozy, and the yard was green and shady. To my knowledge, no one besides Foster and me had visited Mrs. Dempsey, so Miss Barkley packed a big basket full of food for them. I carried it in front of me on the saddle as we rode. We tied our horses to the fence and went to the back of the house. Several children were playing on the small porch with a stone floor. The door was open, and Mrs. Dempsey invited us in when I knocked. Foster wasn't there, but we went in with the girls. "Mrs. Dempsey, I brought Miss Barkley and her cousin to see you," I said cheerfully. The little room wasn't very bright, with only one window and the door. Mrs. Dempsey lay on a bed, hollow-cheeked and haggard. Once she had been a woman of some beauty, but the ravages of trouble and grief were evident in her worn face. Her husband's face had been hard and bitter, but hers wasn't. I wondered how she would feel about the daughter of Barkley who had ruined her husband. "So you're Roger Barkley's girl?" Mrs. Dempsey asked, her bright black eyes fixed on her visitor. "Yes," Miss Barkley replied simply. "My cousin Gwen Langdon and I are here to help you in any way we can," said Diane Barkley, introducing herself to Mrs. Dempsey. There was a moment of silence before Mrs. Dempsey spoke. "You do look a bit like Barkley, but you're not like him at all. You must take after your mother. Miss Barkley, I don't know if I should accept anything from you. Your father ruined my husband," she said. Diane replied, "Yes, I know. That's why I want to help you even more. Please don't refuse. It would mean so much to me." Mrs. Dempsey's resentment quickly dissipated in the warmth and kindness of Diane's manner. Diane's beauty was quickly surpassed by her generosity and nobility. She won over the children and the mother with her charm and opened a big basket of food for them. Meanwhile, I went out on the porch to avoid getting too emotional. I was angry at Jim Dempsey's killer and wished I could have laid my eyes on him. However, Diane and Gwen were practical and focused on bringing cheerfulness, kindness, and help to the family. "Mrs. Dempsey, who dressed this baby?" asked Diane, pointing to a dilapidated youngster on the floor. "Mr. Foster," replied Mrs. Dempsey, choking on her words. Diane was shocked. "He's taken care of us all since... Mrs. Dempsey couldn't finish her sentence. Diane's practicality and kindness were a breath of fresh air for the Dempsey family. She and Gwen were determined to do what they could to help the family during this difficult time. Miss Barkley quickly responded, "So you've had no other help besides his? No other women have offered their assistance? That's a shame. I'll send someone over, Mrs. Dempsey, and I'll come myself." The older woman replied, "That would be very kind of you. You see, Jim didn't have many friends in town, and the ones he did have were afraid to help us. They were afraid they would end up like poor Jim." Miss Barkley was outraged and exclaimed, "What kind of friends are those? Mrs. Dempsey, don't worry any more. We'll take care of you. Gwen, can you help me with the baby's dress?" It was clear that Miss Barkley was having trouble controlling her emotions. Gwen chimed in, "Why, the dress is on backwards. I don't think Mr. Foster has much experience dressing babies." "Well, he did the best he could," Mrs. Dempsey defended. "I don't know what would have happened to us without him. He brought your cowboy, Tim, who's been very helpful, too." "Mr. Foster, then, is he more than just a ranger?" Miss Barkley asked, her voice breaking a little. "He's more than I can explain," Mrs. Dempsey replied. "He buried Jim, paid off our debts, brought us here, bought us food, cooked for us, and even dressed and washed the baby. He sat with me for the first 2 nights after Jim passed away when I thought I was going to die myself. He's kind, patient, and gentle. He's kept me going just by being here. Sometimes I wake up from a nap and see him there, and I know how untrue all those rumors about him are. He plays with the children like any good man would. When he holds the baby, I can't believe he's the same man they call a ruthless killer. He's good, but he's not happy. He has these sad eyes and looks off into the distance sometimes when the children are playing around him. They love him, and I think he must have loved a woman once. His life seems so sad. I ain't nobody to tell me they see good in everything. One time this fella said someone had to be a ranger. I tell you, thank goodness for rangers like him." After that there was silence in the small room except for the baby's cooing. I didn't dare peek at Miss Barkley. I was expecting Foster to show up, and his footsteps didn't surprise me. He came around the corner like he always does, quick and alert with his hand ready. If I was an enemy waiting with a gun, I'd have to be fast. Foster was always on the defense. "Hey there, son, how's Mrs. Dempsey and the little one today?" he asked. "Hey yourself, they're doing great. I brought the girls down," I replied. Then in the semi-darkness of the room, Diane Barkley and Foster faced each other. It was a moment. After seeing her face, I wouldn't have missed it for anything. I'd never forget it as long as I lived. She didn't say anything, but Gwen bowed and spoke to the ranger. Foster didn't show any unusual emotion after the initial start. He greeted both girls pleasantly. "Tim, that was kind of you," he said. "It was women who were needed here. I could only do so much. Mrs. Dempsey, you look better today, I'm glad. And here's the baby, all clean and white. Baby, I had a hard time figuring out how your clothes went on. Well, Mrs. Dempsey, didn't I tell you friends would come? The brighter side will come too?" "Yes, I have more faith than before," replied Mrs. Dempsey. "Roger Barkley's daughter has come to me. After Jim's death, I thought I'd fall apart. We have nothing. How could I take care of my little ones? But I'm gaining courage." "Mrs. Dempsey, don't worry any more," said Miss Barkley. "I promise you'll be taken care of, don't worry," I assured Mrs. Dempsey. Foster's expression lit up with gratitude. "Miss Barkley, that's great," he exclaimed. "That's exactly what I had hoped for." The color rose in her cheeks at his praise. "And thank you, Miss Langdon, for coming," Foster added. "I'm grateful to have you both as allies in this lonely task. For the sake of this good woman and her children, I'm more than glad, but please be careful. Don't leave without Tim. It's dangerous out there." Foster backed towards the door, and I followed. "Wait, Mr. Foster," Miss Barkley called out after him. He made a strange sound and then kicked me so hard I thought he broke my leg. But I didn't say anything. I just watched as Diane Barkley stepped out of the door. She was stunning in her white dress. She didn't even notice me. "I was wrong about you," she confessed to Foster. I could see the emotion building inside him, but he remained calm. "Miss Barkley, there's no need to apologize. I understand why you believed what you did. But please don't say you wronged me. As a ranger, I know that many stories are told about me, and some of them are true. My duty is not always easy, and sometimes it falls hard on those who are innocent. But I also know that duty is hard on me. One day a woman named Miss Barkley approached me. She admitted that she had wronged a man named Foster, both in thought and in word. She had ordered him out of her home, believing him to be someone he was not. But she had been deceived, and now she realized her mistake. Miss Barkley asked for forgiveness and offered her hand to Foster. He took it and held on to it tightly. I could see the struggle in his eyes, torn between the woman's charm and the knowledge of what she had done to him. Miss Barkley continued, speaking with passion and intensity. She praised Foster for his kindness to another woman who had been alone and helpless. But she also revealed that she, too, was unfortunate. I wondered what had led her to this moment, burning with fire and passion. In the end, Miss Barkley's words and actions left a deep impression on me. She had shown courage and humility and had made amends for her past mistakes. And though I knew that duty was hard on me as a ranger, I also knew that it was moments like these that made it all worth it. I may soon need a friend, I thought to myself. The person I need most to lean on is the one who is duty-bound to ruin me, Vaughn Foster. But I had to ask him, "Will you be my friend?" I knew that Diane Barkley would never ask anyone to be false to their duty. We both had to be true to her. I felt so alone, with no one but Gwen who loved me. I knew that I would need a friend soon. "Oh, I know what you'll find out sooner or later. I know now. I want to help you. Let us save a life, if not honor. Must I stand alone?" My voice trailed off as I swayed towards Foster. I expected him to embrace me, but instead he whispered hoarsely, "Diane Barkley, I love you. I must be true to my duty. But if I can't be true to you, then by God, I want no more of life." He kissed my hand and rushed away. I stood there, watching him vanish into the distance. Then I turned to the only other person there, the one who had been listening to our conversation. I reached out to them as a sister might reach out to a brother. Chapter 8. We rode home in silence as the sun set on the horizon. Miss Barkley dismounted at the porch while Gwen and I continued on to the corrals. I felt a sense of unease wash over me as if impending doom was on the horizon. "Can you help me down?" Gwen asked, her voice low and trembling. "Gwen, did you hear what Miss Barkley said to Foster?" I inquired. "I caught bits and pieces." "I heard Foster confess his love for her." "What a mess this is," Gwen replied. "It certainly is. Did you hear why she asked Foster to be her friend?" "No, I didn't hear that. I only heard her confess to wronging him," Gwen responded. I tried to tune out the conversation between Gwen and whoever she was talking about. "Tell me," she had said, but it wasn't her secret to share. "I wish I could do something to help them somehow," the other person had replied. "Yes, it's a terrible situation. I don't care so much about myself." "Nor me," Gwen retorted. "You? Oh, you're just a shallow, spoiled child. You'd stop loving anything the moment you won it. And me, well, I'm no good, you say. But their love. My God, what a tragedy. You have no idea, Gwen. They've hardly spoken to each other, yet are ready to be overwhelmed." I sat there, still and silent, wondering if I had offended Gwen. But at that moment I didn't really care. Her flirtatious behavior towards me and my own problems seemed insignificant. I didn't even look at her, even though she was close enough for me to feel her restless foot touching me. The horses in the corrals were coming up to the bars, and the sky was turning dark, except for a bright golden glow behind the mountains in the west. "So I say you're no good?" Gwen asked after a long pause. Her voice and the way her hand touched my shoulder should have been a warning, but I didn't pay attention. "Yes, you said that, didn't you?" I replied absent-mindedly. "I can change my mind, can't I?" Gwen said. "Maybe you're only wild and reckless when you drink. Mrs. Dempsey said such nice things about you. They made me feel so good." I didn't know how to respond to that, so I didn't say anything. Gwen swung herself around in the saddle. "Help me down," she said. Normally she was very proud of her ability to dismount on her own and would be insulted by an offer of help. But I didn't care. My spirit was dead. Her hands slipped up my arms as she dismounted from her horse, and her face came close to mine. "Tim," she whispered. Her voice was filled with torment, wistfulness, uncertainty, and tenderness all at once. I tried to reach for her hands, but they slipped away. She caught me off guard, and I kissed her without passion, filled with regret and sadness. She let out a little cry that mixed exultation with remorse for her victory and her broken faith. As soon as I kissed her, she remembered her broken faith. She trembled against me, leaving unsaid something she had meant to say, and ran away. She was undoubtedly frightened, and I thought it was for the best. Her spurs clinked away into the darkness, and I laughed ruefully, hoping she would be satisfied. I put the horses away and went in for supper. Afterward, I noisily bustled around my room before sneaking out for my usual evening spying. The night was dark, with no starlight, and the stiff wind rustled the leaves and tore through the vines on the old house. Even though I had seen and heard little during my constant vigilance, the task never became monotonous or made me careless. I had so much to think about that sometimes I sat in one place for hours without realizing it. That night I heard Darling's well-known footsteps right away. Barkley's door opened, and a broad bar of light flashed into the darkness. Darling crossed the threshold, the door closed, and all was dark again outside. Not a ray of light escaped from the window. It had been a considerable amount of time since Darling's last visit, and I had no doubt that his conversation with Barkley would be interesting to me. I cautiously approached the door and strained my ears, but all I could make out was a low hum of voices. It was too risky to stay there, so I made my way around the corner of the house. I had discovered something earlier that I believed would be useful. The older side of the adobe house had a narrow passage between the old and new walls, which led from the outside to the patio. I had stumbled upon it by chance, as it was hidden by vines and bushes. I had planned to drill a small hole through the adobe bricks, but I later realized that the wall was already cracked. I could see into Barkley's room through the crack. This passage was my chance, and I decided to take it despite the great danger. I crawled on my hands and knees, silently making my way under the shrubs to the entrance of the passage. In the darkness, a faint glimmer of light indicated the location of the crack in the wall. I had to enter sideways, squeezing through the narrow space without making a sound. The passage gradually widened in that direction, leading me to believe that the best escape route would be towards the patio. It took me a while to reach my destination, but once I did, the crack was a foot above my head. If only I were taller like Foster. I had to find toeholds in the crumbling walls, bracing myself with my knees on one side and my back against the other to hold myself up to the crack. As I gazed around the room, I could sense the tension in the air. Barkley sat there, twirling his mustache, his face clouded with concern. Darling, on the other hand, appeared even darker and more sullen, but there was a fierce determination in his eyes. "We're settling both deals tonight," Darling declared, his voice full of authority. "That's why I've asked Snecker and Blome to be here." Barkley looked impatient. "But what if I don't want to talk here?" he asked, clearly agitated. "I never before made my house a place to—" "We've waited long enough," Darling interrupted, his tone firm. "This place is as good as any. You've lost your nerve since that ranger hit town. First things first, will you give Diane to me?" "You talk like a spoiled boy, Reuben," Barkley retorted. "Give Diane to you? She's a woman, and I'm finding out that she's got a mind of her own. I told you I was willing for her to marry you. I tried to persuade her, but Diane hasn't any use for you now. She liked you at first, but now she doesn't. So what can I do?" "You can make her marry me," Darling insisted. Barkley shook his head. "Make that girl do what she doesn't want to? It couldn't be done even if I tried. And I don't believe I'll try. I haven't the highest opinion of you as a prospective son-in-law, Reuben, but if Diane loved you, I would consent. We'd all go away together before this damned miserable business is out. Then she'd never know. And maybe you might be more like you used to be before the West ruined you. But as matters stand, you fight your own game with her, and I'll tell you now, you'll lose." Darling grew increasingly agitated. "What did you want to let her come out here for?" he demanded. "It was a dead mistake. I've lost my head over her. I'll have her or die. Don't you think if she was my wife I'd soon pull myself together? Since she came, we've none of us been right, and the gang has put up a holler." "We have to settle this tonight, Barkley," I said firmly. "Well, we can settle Diane's part right now," replied Barkley, getting up. "Come on, let's go ask her and see where you stand." They left the door open as they went out. I sat down to rest and wait, wondering what Miss Barkley's response would be, but I had a feeling I already knew. Darling had proved to be just as bad as I had suspected, and I wished Foster was here to help me. However, he was too big to fit into this situation. The men were gone for what seemed like a long time, but it was probably just my own interest and anxiety. Finally, I heard heavy footsteps. Darling came back in alone, looking defeated. However, his mood soon shifted to anger, and he began to curse and pace the room. Barkley returned, looking calmer. I could see that he was relieved at the rejection of Darling's proposal. "Don't get mad, Reuben," he said. "I can't just give you my daughter like she's some unruly steer. We may be wild out here, but I have my limits." "Barkley, I can make her marry me," declared Darling in a thick voice. "How?" asked Barkley grimly. "You know the hold I have on you from the deal that made you boss of this rustler gang," replied Darling. "I can go to Diane and tell her that I'll tell everyone, including Ranger Foster, unless she marries me." Darling spoke breathlessly, with a haggard face and shadowed eyes. He had no shame, only a fierce passion. Barkley looked at him with a controlled fury, revealing a strong and unscrupulous man who had fallen into evil ways but was still a man. In contrast, Darling appeared to be a wild and passionate weakling. As I observed the two men, it was clear that there had been a time when Barkley had supported Reuben Darling despite the latter's weakness. However, that time had long passed, and Darling had become a self-centered and corrupt individual like many others on the border. Barkley expressed concern that his daughter Diane should never find out about his involvement in rustling and thievery, but Darling was convinced that she already knew or would soon find out. He warned Barkley about Tim, Diane's cowboy companion, and his intelligence. Barkley tried to reassure Darling that Diane was preoccupied with his duties as mayor and certain property matters, but Darling was fixated on winning Diane's affections. He appeared desperate and determined to achieve his goal, even if it meant everyone going to hell. Barkley sat silently, stroking his mustache, his thoughts unclear. With years of experience reading men in high-stress situations, I couldn't help but feel that Barkley had made up his mind to kill Darling. It was surprising to me that he hadn't reached this conclusion earlier. Perhaps the arrival of his daughter had put him at odds with himself. Suddenly, Barkley's dark expression disappeared, and he began to speak with urgency. Though his words were persuasive, I suspected he was only trying to calm Darling's emotions for the time being. Darling seemed completely unaware of the gravity of the situation, too absorbed in himself to notice the line he had crossed. I wondered how a man like him had managed to survive in a place like Pecos County for so long. Perhaps it was Barkley who had helped him along the way, guiding, supporting, and protecting him. But the arrival of Diane Barkley had created a rift between them. "You're being too hasty," Barkley said. "If you rush Diane, you'll ruin any chance of happiness with her. She might be won over, but if you tell her who I am, she'll hate you forever. She might marry you to save me, but she'll hate you for it." "That's not an option," growled Darling. "The gang won't let us go. We can't just leave them behind." "We could sell everything and leave the country," Barkley suggested. "That way you'd have a chance with Diane." "I told you we have to stick with the gang," Darling insisted. "We can't go without their approval. We'd have to sacrifice everything." "So you mean we'd have to double-cross them?" Barkley asked. "Leave them behind to face whatever comes?" "That's exactly what I mean," said Darling. "I'm not that kind of man," Barkley replied. "If the gang won't let me go, I'll stay and face the consequences." "Hey, have you ever noticed that most of our deals in the past few years have been yours?" asked Darling. "Yeah, I know. If I hadn't brought them in, we wouldn't have had any at all. Owen says you've been getting cold feet lately, especially since Ranger Foster arrived," replied Barkley. "Call it cold feet if you want, but I call it common sense. We reached our limit a while ago. We started small, rustling a few cattle when it was still a joke. But as our greed grew, so did our boldness. Then came the gang, the regular trips, and before we knew it, we had shady deals, hold-ups, and even murders on our record. And once we were in, we couldn't turn back," explained Darling. "I think we've all said that before. None of us wants to quit. We all think we can't be caught. We might be blamed, but nothing can be proven. We're too strong," added Barkley. "That's where you're wrong," said Barkley firmly. "I used to think that way too not long ago. I was stubborn. Who would ever suspect Roger Barkley of being part of a rustler gang? But I've changed my mind. I've started thinking logically. We're crooked and we can't keep this up. It's the nature of life, even here in Wild Pecos, for things to get better. The smart thing for us to do would be to divide everything equally and leave the country, all of us." "But you and I have all the stock and all the gains," protested Darling. "I'll split mine." "I won't. That's final," replied Barkley. He spread his hands wide as if to say there was no point in trying to convince Darling. Talking only seemed to agitate him more. A dangerous glint shone in his eyes. "Your stock and property will only do you good until Foster—" "Bah!" interrupted Darling, his voice hoarse. The mention of the ranger's name was like a spark to a powder keg. "You know that Ranger Foster is as good as dead, right?" said one man to the other. "Yeah, I remember you mentioning that," replied the second man sarcastically. "But tell me, how do you plan on making that happen?" "Blome is here to take care of it," said the first man confidently. "Bah!" scoffed the second man. "Blome doesn't stand a chance against Foster. No one on this border is quick and smart enough to take him down." "Why is that?" asked the third man sullenly. "Because Foster is one of the best shots around," said the second man. "I've seen him draw his gun, and let me tell you, it's something to behold." "Well, if Jack doesn't kill him, I will," said the third man, pounding the table. The second man laughed contemptuously. "You're not thinking straight, Reuben. You've been on this border for 10 years, and you think you can take down Foster? You're not even close to being on his level." The third man cursed in amazement, his emotions getting the better of him. "Barkley, I don't like your talk," he said. "Well, if you don't like it, you know what you can do," replied the second man bluntly. "I'm sick of this mess, and frankly, I wouldn't care if Foster took down some of us." He stood up, his demeanor cool and collected, his eyes flashing with danger. "Look, that's not important," said Darling, clearly intimidated by the other man. "What matters is, do I get the girl?" "Only if she consents," replied Barkley, his voice low and cold. "You won't force her to marry me?" "No, no," Barkley responded firmly. "Fine, then I'll make her," Darling threatened. Barkley clearly understood the situation and didn't waste any more words. I knew that Barkley had a gun within reach and was prepared to use it. Suddenly heavy footsteps sounded outside on the porch. It may have been my imagination, but I believed those footsteps saved Darling's life. "They're here," said Darling, opening the door. 5 masked men entered the room. I recognized Blome by his fair skin and hair, his clothing, and his distinguished air. The men were all wearing coats, concealing any weapons they may have had. The big man with broad shoulders shook hands with Barkley, and the others hung back. The atmosphere in the room had shifted. Darling seemed to be insignificant, while Barkley was a different man altogether, a stranger to me. Any hope he may have had of escaping his gang and finding safety in another country vanished at the sight of these men. There was power in their presence, and he was trapped. The big man spoke in low, hoarse whispers, and the others huddled around him at the table. There were signs of membership that were not clear to me. The men bent their heads together, speaking in low voices, asking questions, answering, arguing. I strained to hear a word here and there. The group was deep in planning, and I didn't dare try to decipher their words just yet. I made a mental note of everything I heard, knowing I could piece it all together later. As the rustlers wrapped up their discussion, my mind was racing and I couldn't keep up. I broke out in a cold sweat when I heard that Foster was to be killed by Blome or the gang at his home that very night. Morton was also a target, to be dealt with by Bo Snecker. Anyone else associated with Foster or suspected of being a threat was to be silenced, and violence would be unleashed on the town to intimidate the locals who were starting to question the Rangers' authority. After that, they planned to rustle herds of stock from nearby ranches and drive them to El Paso. The leader of the group, who I later identified as Snecker, left quickly with his son. The rest of the group stayed for a friendly chat with Barkley, smoking cigars and drinking liquor. Blome was charming and talkative, while Darling kept to himself, smoking and drinking steadily. Suddenly he stood up straight as if he had heard something. "What's that?" he called out. The talking and laughter stopped. I strained my ears and heard a faint rustling sound. "It must be a rat," Barkley said in relief. It was strange how sudden or unknown things weighed on him. The rustling turned into a rattle. "Sounds like a rattlesnake to me," Blome said. Barkley got up from the table and looked around the room. Just then I felt a slight movement of the adobe wall behind me. I could hardly believe my senses. But the rattle inside Barkley's room mixed with the sound of dirt falling. The adobe wall, made of dried mud, was crumbling. I felt a tremor pass through it. Then the blood rushed back to my heart, making me feel sick. "What the hell?" Barkley exclaimed. "I smell dust," Blome said sharply. That was my signal to drop down from my hiding spot, but I made a noise despite my efforts. "Did you hear a step?" Barkley asked. Then a section of the wall fell inward with a crash. I began to squeeze my body through the narrow passage toward the patio. "Hear him!" Darling yelled. "Over here!" "No, he's going that way!" someone else yelled. The sound of heavy boots gave me the strength and speed of desperation. I wasn't avoiding a fight, but being cornered like a trapped coyote was another matter. I almost tore my clothes off in that passage. The dust almost choked me. When I burst into the patio, it was just in time. One deep breath revived me, and I stood up with my gun in hand, running for the exit to the court. Thumping footsteps made me turn back. I didn't want to face the odds in a fight when there was a chance to escape. I thought I heard someone running into the patio from the other end. I crept forward, not sure where the door would take me. Gently I nudged it open and slipped inside.